What if a simple message sent by mistake was actually the beginning of something fate had been holding onto for years? A poor little girl, lonely, exhausted, and cradling a sick baby in her arms, typed out a desperate cry for help in the middle of the night. She had no idea that by hitting send, she touched the heart of a millionaire across town. He didn't know her, or at least, he thought he didn't. But there was something about that message. Something that stopped him in his tracks, like he'd read those words before. And without a second thought, he did what no one would have expected. He sent a car, a nurse, medicine, and completely changed that stranger's night. What neither of them could have imagined was that this one act would unlock a door that had been shut for years, because behind that unlikely encounter was more than just kindness. It held an old story, a forgotten bond, a reunion time had tried to erase, but the heart never let go. Who was this woman, really, and why did he feel like he'd loved those eyes long before he ever saw them now? Greenwich, Connecticut, where tall gates and imported cars didn't just hide wealth, they hid stories. And in the middle of all that polished perfection, Leila Bennett was living a very different kind of life. Her apartment was modest, but spotless, small, but warm. Everything she had was the result of relentless daily effort from a woman who, despite all the limits life threw her way, refused to let go of meaning. In the living room, Ash's toys sat neatly in a corner. The scent of eucalyptus floated through the air, coming from a cheap humidifier she'd bought to ease his cough. Leila worked as an admin assistant at a small dental clinic. Steady job, decent pay, just enough to keep the lights on. But the moment her baby got sick, everything started to unravel. It was fall, and the streets were covered in golden leaves. Outside, the world looked calm. Inside, Leila's heart was anything but. She watched every breath her son took like she could hear a clock ticking down. His body was burning up, eyes distant, and the fever wouldn't drop. She didn't have insurance. The meds the pediatrician recommended cost more than what was left in her bank account. That kind of helplessness, it hits like a punch to the chest. She tried to stay composed, but the tension was everywhere, in every movement, every breath as she rocked Asher in her arms. And still, Leila wasn't the type to ask for help. Not unless she had no other choice. That night, though, something inside her cracked. She sat on the edge of the bed, grabbed her phone, and wrote a message, raw, honest, full of fear and love. She was trying to find a contact from an old charity group, but by mistake, she sent it to a random number, across town, at the top of a glass tower. Graham Whitaker, a guarded, respected, and wildly successful CEO, unlocked his phone out of habit. And there it was. It wasn't a business pitch. It wasn't a complaint. It was a cry for help. Raw, real, and for some reason, he couldn't look away. He didn't recognize the number, but the words hit him deep. There was something about that woman, the way she wrote. It stirred up memories he thought he'd buried long ago. Memories of a childhood in a far-off place called Woodstock, Vermont. A strange curiosity began to grow. He took a deep breath and did something completely out of character. He got involved. Back in her apartment, Leila stayed awake, Ash's tiny body still burning as he lay on her chest. Her eyes stung, but sleep never came. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, worrying, and guilt. She had no way of knowing that, at that very moment, on the other side of the city, something was already in motion, something that would change her life forever. The diagnosis hit hard. No sugarcoating. Acute bronchiolitis. The doctor's words kept echoing in Leila's head as she sat there, trying to figure out what came next. The meds he prescribed felt completely out of reach, not because of their complicated names, but because of their jaw-dropping prices. An antibiotic, a daily use syrup, an inhaler with specific capsules, and follow-up care that simply didn't fit into her budget. She crunched numbers, scribbled in notebooks, browsed every pharmacy site she could find. Nothing worked. Her paycheck barely covered the essentials and the little extras Asher needed. He had to get better, she knew that, but where was the money? supposed to come from when even her credit cards were maxed out. Her desperation wasn't just about the treatment. It was the guilt, slowly eating away at her from the inside. Maybe if I'd done more worked more, saved better double quotes thoughts like those sliced through her mind like knives. It was a suffocating feeling of not being enough. The silent crying in the bathroom, the quiet trips to the pharmacy, just to hear the price and walk out empty-handed. The tired look she didn't even bother to hide behind makeup anymore. Everything pointed to the same thing: she was at her limit. Every cough from Asher was like a siren. Every little whimper sent a crushing weight straight into her chest. She tried not to cry in front of him, but her body told on her, hands shaking, breath short, another sleepless night coming. This wasn't just a health issue anymore. This was a brutal test of emotional endurance. And still, through all the pain, Leela tried to hold it together. She held her son like maybe her warmth could heal him, like maybe love was enough. But there were moments, dark, quiet moments, when she stood over his crib and wondered, what if I can't do this? What if he gets worse? What if what if I fail him? She reached out wherever she could. Social media groups, churches, old contacts from her school days back in Woodstock. But most doors closed with polite rejections or empty promises. The few friends she still had were drowning in their own lives, and her last anchor, her parents, were no longer around. The constant fear that Ash's condition might spiral kept her on high alert. Every sneeze, every slight shift in his breathing, every uptick in temperature, it was all a trigger. Her anxiety hovered like a storm cloud, ready to burst, and all she had was a leaky umbrella. That night, when she typed out that desperate message, Leela wasn't expecting a miracle. She didn't expect a reply. What she hoped for, deep down, was just to be heard, to be seen. Maybe she just needed anyone to know what she was going through. Because the hardest part, even harder than her son's fever, was the crushing silence of a world that kept turning while she quietly unraveled. Leela Bennett wasn't the kind of woman who barged into anyone's life. She arrived gently with a warm smile and a presence that brought a quiet kind of calm. The only child of a modest couple from rural Vermont, she'd grown up between forest trails, hand-picked apples, and sunny afternoons on her grandfather's porch, but life, as ruthless as it can be, reshaped that lightness with loss and early lessons in resilience. She was still a teenager when her parents died in a car crash. After that, she moved in with her grandparents in Woodstock, where she learned to treasure the little things: fresh bread in the oven, the sound of the creek, long, unhurried conversations around the table. It was also in Woodstock that she met a boy who would leave a quiet mark on her childhood. But like a beautiful dream, he faded away with time, leaving behind only a faint trace. Leela never complained, even with grief stitched into her bones. She studied hard, started working young, and after finishing high school, set her sights on Greenwich. She got into a tech program, landed an internship, and slowly began building a stable routine. She wasn't rich, not by a long shot, but she was proud of what she'd built on her own. Still, deep down, she always felt like she was a step behind. That's when she met Ash's father, a brief, intense relationship that ended before the baby was even born. He vanished the moment she told him she was pregnant, never answered another message. Leela went through the pregnancy alone: nausea, doctor's visits, sleepless nights, and the fear of raising a child without a safety net. But quitting was never an option. Ash's birth was painful, but it changed everything. He became her strength, her reason, her fight. After the delivery, she cut her hours at work, let go of a course she dreamed of finishing, and learned to stretch every penny. The house her grandparents once owned, the one that could have been her refuge, had been sold years ago to cover her grandfather's medical bills. She was on her own now, but there was still dignity in that solitude. She wasn't fragile, she was resilient. Still, single motherhood came at a price. One, it demanded in silence emotional exhaustion, constant vigilance, the haunting fear of making the wrong move. Sometimes, she'd catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back, deep shadows under her eyes, hair thrown up in a rush, dressed for function, not fashion. But every time she looked at her son, she remembered her purpose. And that was enough to keep going, even with everything stacked against her. Leela was still that same girl who once climbed trees without fear, laughed loud, and believed the world was a good place. She hadn't lost that, she'd simply changed. Not by choice, but by survival. The spark in her eyes was quieter now, but it hadn't gone out. There was still faith, still love, and that night, holding a feverish Asher in her arms, feeling impossibly small in the face of something so big, she pressed the phone to her chest and whispered, "It's gonna be okay, sweetheart. Mommy's gonna figure this out." She had no idea that those same words had once echoed in the heart of a little boy under a tree in Vermont who had never quite forgotten her. Leela's morning started before the sun even showed its face. Even after sleepless nights, she'd slip out of bed carefully so she wouldn't wake Asher, brew herself a strong cup of coffee, and go over the bills in her mind like a checklist from some financial battlefield. They stacked up like cruel reminders that just existing came with a price, especially when you had a small, sick child depending on you. Transportation was another hurdle. She didn't own a car, so she relied on the bus to get to the dental clinic where she worked. On rainy days, it became a whole operation, juggling an umbrella, the stroller, and Ash's diaper bag like some kind of circus act. Sometimes, the impatient looks from people on the bus stung more than any words ever could. Like her struggle was either invisible or worse, an inconvenience. Small setbacks piled up like quiet storms, the leaky faucet, the stroller's flat tire, spilled milk right before they had to leave, the last diaper used up on a Sunday night. None of it catastrophic, but together, it wore her down, and still, she smiled, because quitting just wasn't part of who she was. But the hardest part wasn't the money, or the exhaustion, it was the isolation. Whatever friendships she had left felt distant now. Some had drifted off in other directions. Others just didn't know how to show up for the version of her that existed now. There were days she went without speaking to another adult. Only Ash's tiny voice broke the silence of the apartment, sweet but lonely. Her faith, a gift from her grandmother, flickered on and off like a light in a storm. She still believed, but sometimes, in the middle of those long, coughing nights, she whispered into the darkness, "God, do you still see me?" There were more prayers than sleep in that home. There were moments she thought about pawning her phone, asking for an advance at work, taking out a loan she knew she'd never be able to repay. But every time, she came back to the same truth. Protecting Asher came first. Even if it meant sacrificing everything, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Each no she got from the bank, from the pharmacy, from the people she'd once counted on left a scar. But it also built something else inside her, a quiet strength. The kind that forms when no one's watching. The kind she'd one day need, more than she could know. And maybe that's why, that night exhausted, on the edge, with nothing left to give when she sent that message to the wrong number, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt relief, because for the first time in a long, long while, she had let herself cry out for help. Leela paused before hitting send. The message felt too raw, too emotional, too much. Too many confessions. But she didn't delete it, because every word was true. It came from a place of desperation but also a place of love. She thought of her grandparents, how they always told her not to be ashamed of asking for help, but now that they were both gone, the world felt bigger and colder. For years, they had been her shelter when everything else fell apart. They were her quiet strength. Her grandfather, with his calm stories, used to say, "The right people show up when you need them most, Leela." But now there was no one. They had passed away just months apart. leaving behind a silence heavier than any debt she carried. Selling their house still hurt. It was like losing part of her childhood with those four walls. That home, once her sanctuary, had become a hospital bill. It was painfully ironic. Everything they left behind to protect her had been used to say goodbye, and since then, she'd been doing her best bravely. Yes, but always with that looming fear that the ground might vanish beneath her feet. She tried the practical routes, asked the pharmacy for a payment plan denied, called the public hospital, no openings for another 3 weeks, applied for aid programs, but the red tape felt more like a wall than a helping hand. Every failed attempt chipped away at what little hope she had left. At work, she considered asking for an advance. Her boss, though polite, was firm. "We can't make exceptions." Leela smiled, thanked her, and slipped into the bathroom with tears in her eyes. One coworker quietly offered her $20. She took it. It wasn't about pride anymore, it was survival. Still, it felt like she was sliding down a slope with no end in sight. At home, she tried to keep things steady, pretending the chaos didn't exist. A warm bath for Asher, warm milk, soft cuddles, bedtime stories. But even the fairy tales sounded sad when told through a trembling voice. She didn't want him to feel fear. She wanted him to grow up believing the world could still be beautiful even when it hurt. After another sleepless night, watching Ash's feverish little face, Leela reached an invisible breaking point. That message, the one she sent to the wrong number, wasn't just a mistake. It was her last act of faith before falling apart. She didn't expect a reply. She just needed to believe she'd done everything she could. So, when she finally hit send and watched the message disappear from the screen, she didn't cry. She just stared at the phone, almost like she was waiting for something magical to happen. Like maybe, somehow, the universe had heard her cry for help. And maybe, just maybe, it had started to listen. Graham's first reaction to the message was disbelief. Someone had clearly sent it by mistake. He read it again, then again. Every line felt like it had been written by someone he didn't just know by name but by soul. There was something about those words that stirred a faint, long-buried memory of simpler days. Childhood days in Vermont green fields, sun-soaked afternoons, and summer laughter. Without hesitation, he called his assistant and asked her to trace the message's origin. It only took a few minutes to get the address. He didn't ask himself why, he just acted. He ordered a car, a private nurse, medicine, everything he could think of that might bring relief to the sick child. He didn't know who Leela was, but he knew he needed to help her. This wasn't charity. It was something deeper, something instinctive. When the car pulled up in front of the small apartment building, Leela stared out the window, confused. A well-dressed woman stepped out, carrying a medical bag and speaking in a calm, reassuring tone. "I'm a private nurse, sent by someone who reads your message. May I come in?" Leela froze, her heart racing. Message, her voice cracked. But something about the nurse's steady, gentle gaze made her step aside and nod. As the nurse tended to Asher, Leela sat there, stunned. The name Graham came up in passing. And suddenly, it all blurred together. The wrong message, the unexpected help, and a distant memory of a boy with light eyes who had once shared her summers. Graham, the same name as the boy who had disappeared from her life back when they both still believed friendship lasted forever. Days passed, the nurse kept coming. The medicine started to work. And with Asher slowly getting better, a quiet curiosity began to grow inside Leela. Who was this man now? Why had he helped her, a total stranger, and why did his name Graham Whitaker resonate so deeply in her chest, like an echo from another lifetime? Then came the envelope. No return address, just a short note in handwriting she almost recognized. Woodstock, summer of 2002. You taught me how to climb trees. Thanks for never laughing when I fell. Gee, her heart skipped. The creek boy, the one who stole cookies from her grandfather's kitchen, the one who used to call her his little storm, it was him. The next day, Leela found the courage to write back. She told him about Asher, about her grandparents, about how life had taken her in directions she never planned. She wrote things she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. And she sent it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. That connection she thought was lost forever had quietly returned, soft, unexpected, powerful. There were no promises, no grand explanations. Just the beginning of an old conversation, paused long ago and now gently resuming. And somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hope reignited. Because sometimes, the right people do come back, even through the strangest paths, even if all it takes is a letter, and sometimes, that's enough to light something new within us. It was on a freezing night, while Asher finally slept with the fever gone from his face, that Leela got the call. The doctor's voice was dry, almost robotic. The antibiotic Asher had been taking was pulled from the market. Too many risks, too many side effects. He needed a new one, a more expensive one. Immediately, Leela's heart quietly broke. Just when she thought she could breathe again, the ground disappeared beneath her feet again. She hung up and sat on the living room floor, arms wrapped around her knees. The clock read nearly midnight. The city was sleeping, but inside her, everything was wide awake. Fear, exhaustion, that deep, bone-tired ache that never really left. She thought about Graham, thought about not bothering him. But the truth was, she couldn't keep going through this alone. Something had to change. Now, the messages they'd been exchanging over the past few weeks hadn't just stirred up old memories. They'd reawakened something else too, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in years. Care. Real, steady, human care. He'd never promised anything, he just listened. Asked about Asher. Shared small bits from his own childhood. And that, for Leela, was terrifying in a way, being seen again. Not as a mother, not as a warrior, but as a woman. But that night, the pain was stronger than her pride. She typed, "Asher's meds don't work anymore. I don't know what to do. I've tried everything." No long explanations. No softening of the truth. Just the raw, aching honesty of someone. At the end of the line, she hit send, and finally let herself cry without hiding. Less than 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Impossible, but it was him, Graham, in sweats and a jacket, hair tousled like he'd rushed out the door. He had never come in person before, but now there he was, standing at her door, a pharmacy bag in hand, eyes glassy. "You're not alone," he said, before she could say a word. His presence, so real, so unexpected, broke something in her. But in the best possible way, like an old armor finally giving in. She fell into his arms. No shame, no hesitation. For the first time in what felt like forever, Leela let herself be fragile. And Graham ... he just held her. Tight, steady, like he knew exactly what she needed. Later, as he made tea in her tiny kitchen, Leela sat with Asher curled in her lap and let herself take it all in. Same apartment, same problems, but something inside her had shifted. Graham's gesture, his physical presence, his quiet listening wasn't just help. It was rescue. And right then, without even saying it out loud, she made a choice. She would never again try to carry everything alone, not because she was weak, but because she loved herself enough now to know. True strength in bearing it all in silence. It's in knowing when to open the door to someone who came, not to save you, but to walk beside you. After that night when Graham showed up at her door, Leela felt a subtle shift deep within her. It wasn't just the relief of having the right medicine or the comfort of his embrace. It was something more, something quieter, a sense that, even without promises, she wasn't carrying the world alone anymore. And that changed how she breathed the next morning. Graham stayed present, but always with respect. He called, he checked in, he sent short, thoughtful messages, never intrusive, never demanding, just ... there. And that gave Leela a kind of strength she hadn't felt in a long time. As Asher got better, she started tackling her finances head-on. She found a new pharmacy, negotiated a discount, restructured some debts. They were small wins, but to her, they felt monumental. She also went back to studying at night, online, picking up a course she'd had abandoned during pregnancy. It was exhausting juggling Asher, work, and school, but she felt alive again. Like she was finally building something for herself, not just trying to survive. And in the midst of it all, she rediscovered a woman she thought she'd lost. The hard days didn't disappear. They were still fevers, long nights, moments of doubt. But now, Leela faced it all with more clarity. Not because life had gotten easier, but because she had grown stronger. She learned how to ask for help. She learned how to accept it. And most importantly, she learned to stop blaming herself for needing it. Graham became a steady presence in both her and Ash's lives. Over time, he didn't just help, he showed up. He brought toys, read stories, laughed with her baby. They shared silences that said more than words ever could, and laughter that healed more than she expected. What started as a simple act of empathy had become something real. No labels, no rush, just truth. Months passed. Leela started picking up small freelance jobs online. She built a profile, offered admin services. It wasn't much, but it was hers, something she created on her own terms. And Graham, he watched quietly, with admiration. He never tried to save her. On the contrary, he always reminded her that she was the one making things happen. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Asher sleeping soundly in the stroller, Leela turned to Graham and said with a soft smile, "You know what's crazy? I'm still scared. But now, the fear doesn't freeze me. It just makes me move a little slower. But I keep going." And he answered with a look that said everything: pride, respect, something tender, and steady, and kind. And just like that, the girl who once ran barefoot through the woods of Woodstock, who'd carried grief too heavy for her years, kept walking forward. Not as a weary survivor, but as a whole woman, who had learned that courage isn't the absence of pain. It's the daily choice to keep going, even when everything inside you begs you to stop. Life was slowly falling into place. Asher was healthy, Leela was more grounded, and her bond with Graham kept growing stronger. It still felt like walking over stones, but she was walking steady now. Then one ordinary afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork for her course, she stumbled across something she hadn't seen in years, a faded childhood photo taken in her grandfather's backyard. And there, right beside her, grinning with crooked teeth and messy hair, was him, Graham, but the last name was different. Leela's heart skipped. She flipped the photo over. There it was, written in her grandmother's soft handwriting: Leela and Graham Miller, summer 2002, Miller, not Whitaker. She sat down, stunned, opened her laptop and quickly typed, Graham Miller Whitaker, and then ... everything clicked. Whitaker was his mother's name. His father had left when he was young. He'd legally taken his mom's last name at 18 right before starting his first company. The realization hit like lightning. The man now caring for her child was the same little boy who once needed her to face the dark. The boy who snuck cookies from her grandpa's kitchen. The one who used to call her his falling star because, he said, she always showed up when he needed her most. Fate had brought them back together without either of them knowing. Until now, Leela cried, not from sadness, but from awe. How could the universe be so poetic, and at the same time, so cruel in its ironies? Hands trembling, she picked up her phone and typed, "Do you remember the girl who taught you how to climb the apple tree?" The reply came within seconds. "Of course, I never forgot. Why?" She sent the photo, and then silence. A few minutes later, her phone rang. Graham's voice was thick with emotion. "It's me, Leela. I knew there was something about you. I just didn't know what." They sat in that silence, those few seconds stretching into something sacred. Then he whispered, "You were the first person who ever made me feel safe. And now ... again ... you came into my life at exactly the right moment." The knot in her chest finally loosened. That night, Graham showed up at her door again. But this time, not as a successful CEO, he came as the boy who lost his father too soon, the boy who used to escape to her grandfather's farm each summer, looking for peace, and who, years later, had found that same peace in the eyes of the same girl. Only now, she was a woman and a mother. They talked for hours, reminisced about their summers, bikes, silly nicknames, and slowly, the magic revealed itself. They had never truly lost each other, just lost time, and now, with Asher at the center of it all, this reunion carried a new weight. It felt like the past had been waiting patiently for the right moment to catch up, and there, in that space between memory and rediscovery, a quiet truth settled in. Maybe everything had happened exactly as it was meant to. Maybe even in the mess, the abandonment, the pain, there had been an invisible thread weaving it all together, bringing them here, to this moment, to this embrace that didn't just reconnect them to each other, but to who they had always been. The reunion with Graham brought joy and relief, but also a quiet storm inside. Leela found herself torn between a past coming back in full force and the fear of repeating old wounds. She knew how to love, but she also knew what it felt like to be left behind, and that fear, silent, creeping, started slipping back in the moment she realized she was getting attached. A few days later, while putting Asher to bed, her phone lit up with the name she hadn't seen in almost 2 years, Asher's father, a number she'd long ago blocked. He'd found out about the boy through social media. And now, suddenly, he wanted to step up and be a father. Leela froze. The man who had left her alone and pregnant now wanted to reappear. But why? Guilt, control, ego. Graham could tell something was off. She tried to hide it, but over dinner, while he told a light-hearted story, he noticed her drifting. Until finally, she blurted out, "Asher's father reached out." Silence. Graham's expression tightened ever so slightly, and, "What do you want to do about that?" His question was calm, direct, but behind it was a quiet ache. That night, Leela barely slept. She thought about what was best for her son, but also what was best for herself. She thought about the difference between genuine presence and forced responsibility. And somewhere in the middle of that emotional tangle, she realized she couldn't keep running. It was time to face the past, to set boundaries, to make choices that would finally silence all the ghosts. The next day, she arranged to meet Asher's father in a public cafe. She was clear, steady. "You haven't lost the right to be a father, but trust, that has to be earned. And right now, the best thing you can do for him is respect his space and ours." He tried to argue, but Leela didn't budge. For the first time, she felt in control. When she got home, Graham was there, waiting, and she told him everything, plain, honest, no dramatics, no fear. "I needed to do that on my own, to close that chapter, to free myself." He just pulled her close and said, "I know, and I'm here. Not out of duty, because I want to be." That moment didn't just mark the end of a conversation. It marked a choice, a shared one. And in that instant, Leela realized the real confrontation had never been with Asher's father or the world. It had always been with herself, with the fear, the guilt, the old insecurities from a lifetime spent trying to be too strong. But now she was choosing something else. She was choosing peace. And that's how the biggest conflict of Leela's life came to a quiet close, not with shouting, not with tears, but with honesty, stillness, and truth. Not because everything was fixed, but because she was finally ready to walk toward what she deserved. And this time, she wouldn't look back. Months had passed since that afternoon when Leela faced her past head-on. And the woman who came out the other side was no longer the same. She walked taller now. Her gaze, once tense and guarded, held something only those who've stared down their pain can carry: serenity. Not because life was suddenly easy, but because she had found strength in the middle of the storm. Asher was still her center, more talkative now, more curious, more full of laughter. Watching him run through the house with his arms out like wings was her daily reminder that everything had been worth it. Leela knew now. Being a single mom wasn't a burden, it was an identity. One of the most beautiful, and yes, most demanding, she could ever carry. Her work had grown too. She'd been promoted at the clinic and kept her freelance gigs going strong. She even carved out a tiny home office in the corner of the living room. And the bills, those used to haunt her. Now, they were managed. Nothing had come easy, but she'd learned to negotiate, to plan, to say no when needed. Fear had been replaced by clarity, and in the midst of it all there was Graham. More present than ever, but never taking space that wasn't his. What they had built together came slowly, intentionally, not out of loneliness, but out of respect. There were no more doubts about what they meant to each other. Real love doesn't need declarations. It shows up in small gestures, in full silences, in shared breath. Leela had learned to trust again. To trust others, yes, but more importantly, to trust herself. She began writing about her journey, sharing posts online about a woman ordinary, yet fierce, who fought for her son, rediscovered an old love, and most importantly, found herself again. To her surprise, thousands of women started responding. There was power in turning pain into purpose. She no longer saw herself as a victim of life, but as the author of her story. And every time someone messaged her saying, "Your story gave me strength," she cried, because she knew what it felt like to need strength when the world had gone silent. On Sundays, they drive up to Woodstock. And when she stood in the field behind her grandfather's old house, she felt something close to wholeness. It was as if the little girl who once climbed trees still lived there, only now, she was stronger, wiser. Leela hadn't lost herself. She had only changed, grown along the way, and that transformation, it didn't pull her away from the past, it reconnected her to it in a new way. Because now, she understood, everything she lived, everything she lost, everything she survived had shaped her, and with that truth settled quietly inside her, she knew she was ready for whatever life had left to bring. Years had passed since the night Leela hit send on that message. Now, she and Graham walk hand in hand down a dirt road in Woodstock, the same one where they used to play as kids. Asher runs ahead, smiling, a red kite dancing behind him. It's summer, the same summer from so long ago. But this time, everything is at peace. They didn't build a perfect life, but they built a real one. Graham shared his world with Leela, but he never tried to change her. She didn't become a fairy tale. She became even stronger, wiser. She kept working, kept writing, kept caring. She never forgot where she came from, or who she truly was. And that's what made her so immense in Graham's eyes. One day, while sorting through old documents as they prepared to buy a house together, Leela found an envelope tucked between the pages of a book. Inside was a birth certificate, and there, in the field marked father's name, was a quiet bombshell. Graham was the half-brother of the man who had abandoned her, Ash's biological father. Silence, heavy and unexpected. Coincidence, or a cycle waiting to be broken? The plot twist was cruel, but symbolic. Graham didn't flinch. "Does this change anything for you?" he asked. Leela smiled, holding his hand tightly. "Yes, now I know for sure it was fate. It was you. It's always been you." The same bloodline that had once wounded her was now the very thing healing her. Time had come full circle, not to reopen the wound, but to finally close it with love. They got married beneath the old apple tree where they used to play. Simple, intimate, only the people who mattered. Asher wearing a tiny suit, his eyes glowing, carried the rings. It was more than a wedding, it was a homecoming. To each other, to faith in life. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Leela said something Graham would never forget. "Sometimes, life breaks us ... just to show us how to rebuild, and we only truly get it when we meet someone who helps us gather the pieces, not to put them back the same way, but to create something entirely new. Today, she's a speaker, a writer, and founder of a project that supports single mothers. And every time she steps onto a stage, she ends with the same words, "I'm living." Proof that even a wrong message can change everything, because that's what their story had become. A reminder that hope can come from the most unexpected places. Have you ever helped someone or been helped right when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.